In Malaysia, there are many reports, mainly in isolated regions, about a half-human, half-animal creature, kind of like a Bigfoot, but a little bit different. And these creatures are said to raid villages, abduct people, and then eat them. And of course, not too many people believe these stories. But in 1967, a man named Henry was hunting in the forest. And while Henry was walking slowly and very silently through the trees, listening for big game, he started to hear some very odd and creepy growling noises. And Henry was very familiar with the sounds of this forest, but this noise was different, and it scared him, so he ran. And thankfully he did, as when he looked back, he saw two big hairy creatures with very sharp teeth running right towards him. So Henry grabbed his shotgun, but before he can get a shot off, these beasts knocked it right out of its hands. So Henry did whatever he could to try to get these animals off him, such as hitting them with rocks or branches. And thankfully, Henry's truck was very close by, and once he was able to get inside his truck, he was now able to see a whole group of these hideous looking creatures. And one of these creatures jumped onto his truck and started to smash the window. Now Henry didn't waste any time. He put the keys in the ignition and just floored it out of there. And when he got back to civilization, he let the world know that these creatures do exist. In 1962, a man named Edward and 4 of his friends wanted to go check out a decommissioned ship that was sunk by the US Navy off the coast of Florida. And Edward and his friends thought that it was the perfect place to go scuba diving. So off they went and they set sail towards the sunken battleship in nothing more than a rubber raft. And not too long after they set sail, a fierce storm hit. And the young men were scared as these winds were just tossing them around like rag dolls. And while they were trying to survive the storm, they started to smell something that was just awful. Then they saw a very mysterious creature with a very long neck. And this creature was swimming right towards them. So the young men started to panic, and according to Edward, they were so scared by the sight of this monster that they jumped right off the raft and they swam for their lives. And while they were swimming, Edward was hearing his friends screaming in sheer terror. Now Edward was the only one that made it back alive. His 3 friends were never seen again. And Edward told the authorities about this creature. And he told the police that this monster was responsible for killing his friends. Then Edward drew a sketch of this mysterious sea serpent, and it does kind of look like a plesiosaur. Now since there was no evidence of foul play, Edward was free to go. But it does make us wonder, could Edward actually be telling the truth, or did something else happen to his friends on that tragic day? This next encounter comes from Teddy Roosevelt himself from his 1892 book, The Wilderness Hunter. According to Teddy Roosevelt, a man named Bowman and his partner were hunting beavers near Montana's Wisdom River. And after the men got done setting up camp, they decided to go set a few traps as they still had some sunlight left. But when they came back, they saw that someone or something had just ravaged their camp. Now Bowman thought that it was a bear, but his partner wasn't so sure. So the men decided to light a torch and look for some tracks to see who or what was to blame. And they found some very big tracks, and the men were convinced that these tracks were not from a man, as the tracks were just too big. So Bowman assumed that it had to have been a bear, but his partner disagreed as he didn't believe that a bear could stand on its 2 legs for that long of a time period. But the men shrugged it off, and they didn't think too much more about it, and they decided to get some sleep. And while the men were sleeping, Bowman started to hear some noises outside his newly made tent. And when he looked through the opening, he saw a huge creature. He had never seen anything like it before. So Bowman grabbed his rifle and shot at it. And the sound of the gunfire scared this beast, and it ran back into the forest. Now this encounter terrified Bowman, so Bowman told his partner that they needed to stay up, just in case this creature came back. So the men sat next to the fire, and they tried their best to stay awake. Then they heard a terrifying howling noise coming from the forest, and this noise was not that far away. Now Bowman and his partner had never heard anything like it before, which is really odd considering they both had spent most of their life in these woods. And at first light, the men were ready to get the heck out of here, but they still had to get their traps. So Bowman went to go get the traps while his partner stayed behind to pack everything up. And when Bowman returned, he saw that everything was packed, but his partner was nowhere to be seen. So Bowman figured that he must have went in the woods to go to the bathroom or something, but he never returned. So Bowman went looking for him, and just right outside their camp, he found his partner lying on the ground dead. His partner's body was just mutilated. His neck was broken and his throat was covered with all sorts of puncture wounds. and Bowman also noticed these huge tracks again, and these tracks were all around his friend's body. Now Bowman didn't believe that this was a bear attack. He believed that this was something else, and he grabbed his things and he took off as fast as he could. And Bowman later stated that a goblin killed his friend. Now many people believe that it was simply a bear attack. Teddy Roosevelt remained undecided. But years later, once the Bigfoot phenomena swept the nation, people look back on this story now believing that maybe a Bigfoot was to blame. One of the most famous attacks involving a Bigfoot happened in Ape Canyon in 1924. And I have covered the story before, but I'll quickly cover it again for those that have never heard about it. The story goes a man named Fred Beck and 4 of his friends were mining for gold near Ape Canyon. And when Fred went to go fetch some water, he and one of his friends saw a very large hairy humanoid in the tree line. And this creature was just staring at the 2 men. And Fred was so shocked by the sight of this hairy human ape-like creature that he pulled out his gun and he shot at it. And the creature ran back into the woods. And that night back at their cabin, the 5 men started to hear loud bangs on the roof. They realized that something or someone was throwing very large rocks at their cabin. Then, something crashed into the side of the cabin with great force, and the men started to pray. Now there were no windows within this cabin, but there was a little opening between 2 of the logs. And when Fred looked outside, he saw 3 huge hairy creatures, and these creatures were picking up rocks, slamming into the cabin, just trying to knock it down. And luckily for the men, this was a very well-built cabin that was built to withstand the very harsh winter climate. Now these attacks went on for most of the night, and the men didn't think that they were going to make it. But as the sun started to rise, these creatures ran off back into the woods, and the men didn't waste any time. They headed back for civilization as fast as they could. Now after this encounter, there were many articles written about this attack, and most do believe that these men are telling the truth, as throughout the years, their story had never changed, and not one of them had ever come forward saying that they made it all up, making this a very interesting case. There are stories being told from Japanese vets who were stationed in Papua New Guinea during World War II. These vets stated that while they were defending these islands from the Allies, they were constantly being attacked by pterosaurs, or what they called the Kor, or what the natives called the Ropin. And the Japanese army retaliated by destroying their caves. Now I find this story very interesting, as there are tons of stories within this region about people being attacked or abducted by the Ropin. And these attacks are a little less frequent today than what they were in the past, but many people do believe without a shadow of a doubt that these creatures still live within this area, as well as in other parts of the world, especially Africa. And since these stories are coming from vets, it does add a little bit of credibility to the theory that these pterosaurs just might still exist in some of these remote regions throughout the world. Until next time, this is Paranormal Junkie. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned.